Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel them both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. You might recognize that as the opening stanza to the Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken. It's the poem that ends, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and it has made all the difference. That's probably even more familiar. I remember being exposed to that poem. It was probably the first poem as a whole poem that I was actually taught or read or really fully exposed to. I think I was a freshman in high school. And as I was exposed to and read and saw this poem really for the first time, two things happened in me that I recall. One was a kind of, I guess, embarrassed response. Poems were written by and for hyper-emotive, weird people. And that if you were into poems and you liked poetry, then you must be a hyper-emotive and weird person. I was on the football team. I ran track. I was a guy. That was the one thing happening in my brain. The other thing happening in me was that I was really resonating and I really liked the poem and I really liked the rest of that section in our English class about poetry. Something about the very intentional use and shape and reframing of words actually resonated with my soul. That tension resolved itself over years till beginning and even later in high school. As life got weirder and required more complex and deeper emotional responses, poetry became an actual feature in my life. Something I attempted to write, but definitely I started reading more poetry all the way through college, and to be entirely honest, really in the last decade or so. The more I've spent time intentionally in my own inner universe and done my best to come alongside people working in the arts and working in religious spaces where life is hard and complex and weird and strange. Poetry has not just become a useful tool or a powerful practice. It has become a really safe, generative, and transformative aspect, expression. It's a beautiful part of my life. I listened to Scott Cairns read and lecture at the Festival of Faith in Writing, I believe it was in 2016. And not only was I struck by his writing and the way he read the things he wrote, I was really captured by the way he talked about his work. It's one of those aspects of art making that oftentimes inspires me. So someone who's excellent in their craft and has the ability to talk about what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. I've been thinking about and hoping to catch Scott to talk about the power of poetry, the essence of poetry, and the necessity of poetry for a really long time. And so I'm really glad I got some time to sit down with him. I enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you for joining me this morning.
Sure.
Or this afternoon. Oh, it's almost this afternoon. You're on the West Coast. Yes?
Yeah.
We share a time zone.
Yeah.
You're in the Pacific Northwest.
I am now. Yeah.
And that is where you're from originally as well?
Yeah. In fact, this house my dad built, and
wow.
When we inherited it about 6 years ago, that's when we made the play to come back from the wilderness, which I've been wandering for 40 years.
Where was the wilderness? I know you spent some time in Utah. Where was the wilderness?
Well, I initially left here, I guess in 1977 to go to graduate school in Virginia. And then from there to graduate school in Bowling Green, Ohio. And then from there to teach for a while at Kansas State University. And then to do a PhD at University of Utah. And then to teach at University of North Texas. And then to teach at Old Dominion University. And then to teach at University of Missouri, where I was for nearly 20 years. And then until we left there to come here.
Did it feel like coming home? Did this?
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, I mean, it might be obvious for for some people, but coming back to a house your father built, how
Yeah.
important is geography to you? When you think of home, was
This
the
is
Pacific
always
Northwest was always home, regardless of where you
always
were.
has been. It's always, and I guess I've thought of it over the years as the landscape of my imagination. And so even when I was away, I was probably a lot of the figuration in my poems over 40 plus years has included
Yeah.
sort of a northwesty flora and fauna
Yes.
array of such. And so no, it's always been where my mind dwells, even though my body was moving around.
Talk to me about moving and about being elsewhere. Was it do you create a sense of home when you're out and you're living somewhere else, or does it feel more like, or is the experience more like I am somewhere for work? For some folks, they'll be in a place even for 6, 7, 10 years, and
Yeah,
it's like being in a like a long term what's it, like satellite location
yeah.
where they're like working away from home for close to a decade. Do you create a sense of home?
Yeah, I have always felt pretty much at home with the community that, we've always established something of a community, or, allowed others to establish something
Yeah,
of a community with us, and have always been, relatively fully engaged, I
yeah.
suppose, in that community. And it has always been home. My children were born in Utah, raised in Texas, Virginia, and Missouri. And wherever they were, where my wife Marcia was, and our whatever iteration of Labradors we had at the moment, that was home.
A dog was a key element to home.
We've always had dogs, and we've mostly had Labradors, which are the best dogs. I hope you don't get mail about
You never know these days. You get like
that.
whatever. I don't know what trips people up anymore. We would just kind of talk about everything.
Yeah,
Um, you've been writing for a number of years. The 10 or
yeah,
depending on how you count, 10 or 11 volumes of poetry.
yeah.
Um, can you talk a little bit about the impetus for poetry in your life from the outset and then ongoing? In other words,
Yeah,
what leads you to begin writing in general, but specifically to write poetry? And then what keeps you coming back? There he is right there. There's a Labrador, which I just talked about. Like, speak of the Labrador and it'll appear. What leads you initially to begin writing in general, but specifically to write poetry? And then what keeps you coming back
yeah.
to poetry? Because it's not the only work you do, but you continue to come
It's
back and
mostly what
add
I
to the
do.
books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'd say that it's changed somewhat over the years. Initially, I suppose it had to do with engage. Well, maybe that hasn't changed. Engaging what I read has always been part of the mix.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, I think initially giving voice to something that was in me in response to those things, and that may still be, maybe it hasn't changed, but uh, I think I was more concerned early on with expression, and
Okay.
now I'm curmudgeonly enough to insist that literature, especially poetry, is not primarily the art of expression.
Hmm.
Uh, I've moved from, if there's a spectrum from poetry is just expressing yourself to I'm at the other end, where poetry is more of a way of knowing. It
Interesting.
becomes it has become for me increasingly over these decades a a way to find out not just what I think, but find out what I don't think. Find out what I don't.
Fascinating.
Not just to put language to what I think I know, but more more importantly to come to terms, quite literally come to terms with I'd say provisional terms
Hmm.
with the mystery that I hunger to apprehend, and long to apprehend. And I think that probably since my second book, that's been how I operate, writing to find out rather than writing to express. And I would just suggest to youngish writers who may have drunk the Kool-Aid of poetry as self-expression to spit that stuff out and drink something else.
And to some degree, it's almost necessary, right, to have that season in
I
which you're
suppose,
maybe
yeah.
self-expressive to kind of get that out of the old system to make room for
Well,
a new thing.
yeah, I guess that's where one learns to articulate. You know, there's a sort of amorphous thought going on in
Sure.
your head, and you want to put it into an utterance. And so the correlation between this sort of vague impulse of thought to an articulation, you need to learn how to do that,
Yeah.
certainly. But then at some point, I think the language itself leads the real poet. Yeah, well, well, I think this is true for any writer,
Okay.
not just poets, but you learn to engage your own language to such a degree that you see what's hiding in it that you didn't notice before. And this is, and there are a lot of ways to get at that. One
Yes.
of the ways that I've often advocated in my teaching was that students, they don't have to become fluent in other languages, but they really are selling themselves short if they don't learn some Romance language or Latin itself and a good bit of Greek in order to actually even know what English does. Our language is a wonderful language for poetry, particularly because it's haunted by so much other connotative pressure. And and if you're ignorant of the Latinate languages and if you're ignorant of Greek, you really don't know the language you ostensibly are working with. The more you see those languages haunting suggestively how an English word means,
Yes.
or how it reaches its connotative span, the better off you'll be at doing this thing I want more of us to do when we make
Yes.
poems, is to let the language teach us something.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Not just to put from my head into your head something
Yeah.
I thought, but to look at the poem on the page as a scene of meaning making.
Yes.
It's not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a story. This is how I read, not just poetry. This is how I read.
It's to let the phrase you just used, which I thought was fantastic, is to let the language, even as a writer, to let the language teach us something, as opposed to the more, I think I'm going to get this correct, not correct. I think is what I mean to say. As opposed to the more controlling use of language, that I have words that I'm going to use to achieve a certain goal or to make a certain impact.
That's basically the act of denotation, which is a useful thing, a useful act. There are a lot of texts that we really love for their denotative capacities or abilities. You know, like Christmas Eve, you're putting a bicycle together when everyone's sleeping.
Yes.
It's really good to know how these words can teach you to do that thing.
Yes, but because if IKEA sent you home with with a poem, you're in trouble.
Yeah,
things are already in Swedish.
Yeah, so there are I mean, there's a lot of, most of what we do with language is, to respond to its denotative abilities and benefit from them. But when it comes to making literature, and in particular poetry, I think the connotative reach of a word is far more pertinent to our accomplishment.
As an educator and a writer, I'm thinking a little bit about have a touch of conversation here about audience, your audience in a classroom versus your audience on the other side of a volume of books.
Yeah.
Or a book. Can you talk a little bit about language, particularly among college age students, and the impact maybe that you've seen or the influence you may have seen with regards to the way the social media, the internet, and folks engaging in language online has maybe changed the way we embrace, take in, use language? Because if what we're talking about is, we hang, the launching point being the allowing language to teach us something versus using our words to accomplish the thing. Most
Yeah.
of what I experience online is very controlled. I mean, from Twitter saying you have so many words to get to, but
Yeah.
has there been, like, there's a greater access to a breadth of expressiveness online, so people have a broader access to a lot more expressions, different languages, but the machinery seems to bend folks towards utility rather than knowledge, because like language
Right.
is a way to
Right.
know yourself. Has it
And
had a qualitatively negative experience, like folks' use of
well,
the
don't you
internet?
think? Yeah, don't you think so?
I don't know. This is why I asked the questions. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Like I think I think the easy answer is no, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to pay attention to it because it's pervasive, and
Well, yeah, I think solipsism is destructive, and if in fact all your time is spent expressing your own learned or less learned opinion on a matter, um, the less, the more time you spend doing that with your language, the less you're likely to find the thing that will free you from your own impulses, be they good or bad. Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time reading a lot of. I do spend time on social media. I have friends with whom I communicate that way, and I don't want to lose touch with them. But by and large, my experience on such media, uh, over the long over most generally speaking,
yeah.
it it's just further evidence of how language as expression can really poison the mind
Hmm.
and really sink the heart and really isolate the individual. No matter how social that seems, it really is all one's own interior monologue that shuts out the dynamic conversational possibilities, which would free us from ourselves
Hmm.
and connect us to others and connect us to our God, ostensibly.
Yes.
Um, the mystery is what I'm after, and what we're talking about now is almost seems to be a really intentional insulation from the
Yeah.
mystery. So yeah,
One of the things that
I'm not a big
poetry,
I'm not a big fan of that discourse.
understandable.
Okay.
Uh, One of the things you said a moment ago, you talked about a connection to other people, and that
Yeah.
this is a worthwhile and I think accurate critique of a lot of the way social media postures us, is a kind of deterioration of that connection between people. Whereas the one of the gifts at times, or hopeful gifts, of poetry or thoughtful language is that connection that a person has as a reader
Yeah.
to a work or to the artist. Seth Godin, one of the things I come back to often, Seth Godin suggests that art is anything someone creates that forges a connection between people, that it's really the connection that makes it art. How aware are you of your readership as you're either writing or uh, collecting a volume of poetry? Because it was your most recent piece. I believe it's called Anaphora, if I'm saying that correctly.
Anaphora, yeah.
Anaphora. As you're collecting the pieces or writing these pieces, are how aware are you of your readership, of those who come to it? Do you have folks in your mind? Like, what role does that play in the process of writing, collecting, and assembling a volume of poetry?
I'd have to say, to be honest, not much.
Fascinating. Yeah, go on. Say more.
Yeah. Well, as I've suggested, the reason I keep writing is because I want to keep knowing. What someone else gets out of it, I pray that someone gets something out of it. But my goal is to build a thing on a page that isn't just delivering what I made of it, but is making a space where the reader can make with it and bring his or her or their own matter to bear upon that language on that page.
Yes.
And to make something of it. Literally just to make something of it, make meaning with it. So to anticipate how they might do that is kind of, it strikes me as futile. I don't know what their baggage is, what they're going to bring to the page. So how would I imagine I'd be writing in order to facilitate their doing something with that matter on this page? Well, I can't, so I don't. What I can do is see how this word choice, this line shape, this turn opens me moment by moment through the poem. I see how word choices and line breaks, various caesura, facilitate my seeing for a moment more than I meant to say. And if I do that, then I'm keeping that. But I can't anticipate the cues that another might. I have a sense of how people who actually read poetry might read this, but that's not a high percentage of our population.
No, it's not.
The people who actually read poetry and pore over poetry. I think those who do would share with me this notion that the poem isn't a coded message behind which is some meaning the poet is hiding from them. I know that this is how, though my own father didn't teach this way, he was an English teacher in high school. Not my high school, but he was a high school English teacher who knew how poems worked. I learned from him how poems worked. But I also know that I took creative writing classes in high school and college, and I know that people basically present these as encoded, encrypted messages from evidently inept messengers who
yes.
How many times have you heard, what is the poet trying to say?
Or what is this, or what does this mean?
But both of those are missing the point. The poet isn't trying to do anything but make a poem. What the poet is trying to say, if there was something a poet, a gifted, accomplished writer, was trying to say, he'd damn well say it, and you'd get it. But why is the poem difficult? Well, the poem is difficult because there's more to what it can say.
Interesting.
Than the poet might anticipate. And that's why the poet makes the poem, is so that the poet can herself see something more than what was already thought.
And one might hope that's why the reader reads, is not to get the message on the other side, but to actually do that same work internally.
And people who read poetry as a matter of have poetry reading as part of their lives, they know that. They don't need to be told that. A lot of people will pick up a poem and they'll try to do this other thing with it. Say, well, what's he hiding from me? I don't. It's difficult. I don't quite see all the. I don't see the meaning here. Well, they could learn to. I mean, it would take discipline and practice and repeated exposure to that sort of discourse to be able to benefit from it.
Yes.
In that way, to open their own imaginations to making something of language. But so no, I don't write for them, and they don't read for me. So
Fascinating. That's
it,
fantastic. It's
we
very
have an
good.
agreement. We have an agreement.
Excellent.
They don't read me, and I don't write to them. So there we
I
go.
I worked with a visual artist a number of years ago here in the Bay Area. Her name is Laura Van Duren. And um
Oh yeah, I know
in
Mark Endurance poetry. Is there a relationship there?
I'm not totally sure, actually. Could be. But in relationship to this conversation, uh, visual artists often have the same uh sort of catching point with like new viewers or with the general populace in general. With what does this mean? What's that this thing you've done must be coded? What's it really about? And she started with a number of pieces, but she initially created this very, very large installation piece, large enough that you could and were invited to climb inside it. It was this massive piece. It was like
Oh,
2 stories
great.
tall. And on the inside of the piece were 30 or 40 pens dangling, and as viewers would climb these ladders, they were invited to take the pen and write some sort of like, what are you, now that you're in this piece, what's in you? And she began this conversation. And so instead of answering the question verbally, like, this is what this piece is about, inviting those who are engaging with the piece, like, no, the question, I'm asking a question with this piece. I'm not trying, I'm putting this on the table so that you can engage and do your own work of self-examination. And it was a fascinating, it was that work, and the way she executed that unpacked a lot for me as an artist. Like, oh, that's right. I mean, it's a bit scandalous to let someone else, or when it seems scandalous to let someone else do what they will with your piece. The other side of that coin is like, is that not what we do anyways? When you release it into the world, as soon as it's on a page and you don't have it in your head anymore, you are actually doing that with folks. It is the risk we take by having an audience as an artist, is they're going to do with this something other than what you would command or demand or even
at
want.
least this way, she's collecting some data for how those responses might result. And so no, that's fascinating. I like that very much. I've been lately thinking about sort of moving away from teaching altogether, but sort of running spiritual writing retreats, not workshops per se, but just writing retreats where we talk about, a bunch of people who want to do spiritual writing of whatever genre. And we find a nice place on Whidbey Island. We tuck ourselves away for a long weekend and visit. And so thinking ahead to doing that in the future, I'm thinking about, well, what might we say to begin this so it doesn't feel like just a waste of time for everybody? And I thought, well, begin with a question is actually what came to my mind. What is spiritual writing? Well, it's never something that begins with a declaration.
Yes.
It's always something that begins with a question. So I think that kind of contextualizes the whole project. At least my experience of my own project over the past several decades is, begin with the question. And when I sit down to write, begin with the question. What do I want to know? Well, I want to know everything. So that's really limit. But I think the spiritual life is really one of continuing to begin every day with a question, and then I guess through discipline and prayer and whatever vocational gifts one might have, you employing those to listen for provisional answers. I think all answers, of course, are provisional because we don't have the big picture, but
yes,
we have a discrete, albeit authentic picture moment in that
Yeah.
span of things. And so the answers come, but you have to be respected as provisional.
That's good.
Serving the moment, maybe not serving tomorrow's moment. But
That leads me to talking about spiritual writing and writing as a way to know. You among your works, you did, I think it was a one volume of translations of Christian mystical
right.
writing.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear. I'd love for you to share a little bit about what you. I don't want to. The broader way to ask the question: what was that like for you? I want to ask something in the midst of some sort of combination of what was it like for you? What did you learn? And how did you see yourself and God differently on the other side of a work like that?
Well, most of those people whose works I poured over to that degree, I mean, that's the great advantage of attempting translation, regardless of one's facility with the other languages. There are lexicons you can have at, and you can, slowly parse together some making choices along the way, seeing something being said, glimpse something being said in your language, which was just previously in another language. And that kind of mind opening, language opening exercises very efficacious in any case. But in the case of working with these particular texts, I I did some other texts which I just ended up not thinking were worth sharing, but these ones, in every case, so I thought of them as actual mystics, people who had glimpsed something true. They had, I don't know where you line up on the notion of inspiration, but I don't believe that even the scriptures are verbatim dictated texts, but what they are human expressions given a God and a sort of illumination that results in a vision. And the vision, the theoria, as we like to say in Greek,
Yep.
The theoria is not exactly verbal, but to share it, these mystics have recourse to verbal expression, or they wrestle with it into their own languages and come up with something. And also provisional, never eclipses the mystery, but always, if it's working well, gives some degree of access to that mystery. And so, yeah, I poured over these texts slowly. My Greek isn't that good. Most of those were Greek. The ones I love most, were Syriac, and I don't have any Syriac. So I was working off of Greek and English translations of Saint Isaac of Syria, whose works I just love. And I think I'm too old to learn Syriac, so I'm going to have to stick with the Greek and the English. But these are men and women who have, through a life of prayer, come to some point at which they apprehended more than we do typically, and took the time to share it, and then it opened me up to a lot of notions I hadn't anticipated. So the practice, it was finally, that volume was very selfish. It was very self-serving, because it really
In what way?
Well, it gave me a taste of their vision.
Hmm.
And my own prayer life has, been intermittent over the years, and off and on, accommodating to a vision, but nothing you can count on. So so if you can find other doorways into the vision, open those doors. And that's how I think of that book, and that's how I think of that practice. I
Yeah.
still do. I'm still working on stuff like that, but
Translation work.
yeah, I'd say it's I, I tend to call them paraphrases uh, when I'm working off of languages I don't own. Like, for instance, the book I'm working on now is one of the books I'm working on now is a sort of a selection of sayings from the homilies of Saint Isaac of Syria.
Hmm.
He's like the best of all saints. It's like the Labrador is the best of all dogs. Well, Saint Isaac is the best of all saints. So that might be controversial.
Yeah, that's the other volume. There's the academic volume that's just
But
strictly the saints, and then the popularized volume, the Chicken Soup for the Soul volume,
yeah,
includes the dog.
yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've been working with Saint Isaac of Syria, though I've been reading him for at least a couple decades now, and the the result has been, when you pour over a text that discrete of so I just pull out a piece of it and I pour over it and I mess with it and I study it and I read it again and again. And I kind of work out my translation again and again and again. And that slow process does yield, however, great benefit for glimpsing something that hadn't been glimpsed. And that's,
Yes.
this is the same song I keep singing to you, is that
That's a great song.
why I do it, is so that I see more.
Yes.
A little bit more each time I set out. And so I'm working on that. I'm working on some other things with Greek poets.
Yeah.
Not necessarily religious Greek poets, but Greek poets.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between in your life specifically, but maybe even more broadly if you feel comfortable doing so, the relationship between creative writing, like creativity in language, and religious practice? That and I ask this specifically because so much of Western, definitely evangelical mainline Christian practice is language based and highly controlled, that there are particular words that mean particular things for the particular culture.
Can we stipulate that the language upon which that is based is, I'd say, not quite well received language? I mean, it's language treated as if language were a brittle,
yes,
immobile thing.
This is what I'm actually asking. So there is a there's like a courage in creative writing.
So I'm still thinking of myself as an evangelical.
Yes,
because I know what the word means. It means it's a faith based upon the evangel, which are the gospels. What you find, I think, unfortunately, amongst self-identifying evangelicals these days is a privileging of Leviticus over the Gospels. So I would call them Leviticals more than I would call them evangelicals, and that there's a kind of a rigidity. But even the Levites and even the Jews who read text don't read text that way. They don't read their own Leviticus the way an evangelical would read Leviticus. They see it as the end of the story, and a rabbi reading the text sees it as the beginning of the story.
Or more the way Laura Van Duren presents that piece to her audience is it's an invitation in, and the beginning of it's the beginning of your retreat on Whidbey Island. It's a question, as opposed to here's the statement, move on from here. It's an invitation. This is part of what I'm asking is like that's is that predominantly a language problem? Is that predominantly an issue? Is the
Yeah, it's a chicken or the egg. I don't know. Is it predominant? It's reading to see what you want to see. It's always a bad idea, right?
yeah.
Projecting on this. Let's can we let's agree that the texts of our sacred literature,
Yes.
those texts are live texts.
Yes.
They're not dead.
No.
They're not just retrospective. They're prospective. So if you look at one of those texts and you try to, and you see their difficulty as an impediment to your understanding whatever truth is hiding behind them, you're going to treat it a certain way. You're going to think of the text as retrospective. You're going to, as a document of something past, and you're going to try to get back into that past singular isolated truth.
Yes.
And then you're going to say, now I know what it means. But no, it never worked that way. Not for the rabbis, not for the Jews, not for the early Christians. The first 1,000 centuries of the first 1,000 years of our faith, everyone knew that. Everyone who read knew that the text was a live text. And I guess increasingly it's become treated as a brittle kind of encrypted message.
Yes.
Much the way our teachers in high school would try to teach poems. They'd say, there's something here.
Yes.
Let's get these poems out. Let's get the poem out of the way and get at the thing. Well, that's how a lot of, I think, people who self-identify as evangelical Christians read the scriptures, as the scriptures are kind of in the way because they're unwieldy, they're paradoxical, parabolic, a little contradictory if you look at it all at once.
If you're actually reading them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what they'd rather have is some certainty hiding behind it. But
yes,
or as if, and I guess the worst thing that we do with that now is to extrapolate from that a sense that the future's already written. I think that's the most dangerous thing we do, so that we think that when we say God knows all and controls all,
yes,
we're kind of ignoring one of the sort of centerpieces of our faith is that no, we have to share. We're co-workers with this God.
There's a participation element.
Absolutely. And if without that participation element, we're this sort of static stick figure waiting for something to happen. And what we do doesn't matter because the future's written. Well,
you mentioned you used the word fragile a minute ago when you talked about some folks' approach to the sacred texts, and the treatment of them, of the text, does have this kind of air of fragility. To be careful with how you read, interpret, and discuss this thing, because you in some way might break it. When in reality, the thing that is fragile is the things that are fragile are my conclusions. That's the thing that is fragile, and it is, in fact, one would hope, the thing that is broken, that fragility, my conclusions, my solidity with regard to this is how the world works, that would be the thing that actually breaks like water on the shore of this text that doesn't invite conclusion, but invites relationship. One would hope, which is again one of the gifts of the poetic tradition, not just in the scriptures, although even that gets relegated to textbook form. But one of the gifts of the poetic tradition among contemporary practitioners of faith is that poetry does the work in readers of, I use this phrase a lot, of sort of this disorientation. I'm disoriented in relationship to language I know, or I think I know, and leads me into what you mentioned earlier, a kind of a different kind of knowing, that it's not a matter of like, this is the thing, this is the conclusion I've come to, and now I know it, I've controlled it, I've named it, and it is mine. But the kind of knowing that's more expansive and ongoing, that is an openness to mystery. This is very poetry does that work of disorienting me towards I think I know, and inviting me into a very different kind of knowing. Can you talk about actually, I think what I want to do is there are words that and I do this with some guests, is it's kind of like an investigation of lexicon in a sense, that there are words that sort of either appear in your work or revolve around your work. And all I want to do is I want to put a few words, kind of set them on the table and have you respond to the word, and just kind of whether there's a story or a kind of definition. And I want to begin with the word religion. When I say the word religion, what happens in your mind, your soul?
Well, first thing I thought when you said that was, I wonder if that's why I don't use the word religion.
Exactly.
So, I don't blame the word for this, but I guess more often than not, I use the word faith, where I guess I might have used the word religion. I speak of my faith or our shared faith. When I think of our faith, the Christian faith, I think of not just the scriptures, but all the centuries of saints who have written and have lived that life. And when I think of religion, I guess that seems like a step away from the faith. In a way, maybe it's the begin when we construct a religion, with its tenets. I suppose unless those tenets are also appreciated as provisional, what we're doing is we're closing in the faith and saying this is the faith, but what about this? That's not the faith. I love how Bishop Callistos Ware speaks of the church. He says, we can say where the church is, we cannot say where it isn't.
Wow.
Yeah, he was an Orthodox bishop. and this was in response to a lot of people clamoring to say Orthodoxy is the only true expression of the faith. And, I think he was wise enough to know that that's not true.
Yes.
Why would you aver that?
It's not a true question, so you can't offer a true answer to it.
Right. So what he said, well, we can say where the church is, but we can't say where it isn't.
Wow, that's fantastic.
The members of Christ's body may well be outside the scope of what you would call, or any one person would identify as the church, or even where Bishop Callistos Ware I'd say this is the church. These people participate in the faith.
That's good.
Even though they may not participate in the church. And so that's just a long-windy.
That's great. No, there's a lot here.
In response to your provocation of what do I hear when I hear the word religion, I think of that kind of unfortunate constraining of a pretty vertiginous faith.
Yeah.
A delicious, satisfying faith, and confining it to the realms of a package of what we would identify as a religion. So how's that?
It's fantastic. This is why we do the practice. The word education, you're someone who's you've worked in academia, you've published works that would be, at least to some degree, rightfully used in educational settings. Talk about education. The word education. What does it mean to be educated? What is an educated person?
Well, not to sound curmudgeonly, but too many people forget what that word means. They don't have enough Greek to know that.
Give us the Greek.
When one educes, that's the root of education. One draws out. You don't put stuff in and call that education. You draw out. So something in my students exists before I get in the room. My job is to educe, is to draw it out so they recognize it and benefit from that recognition. So education really has to be understood as drawing from the ephebe, the student, the young person, drawing into view something that's already theirs, and drawing it out and putting it out in front so that they can see it and recognize it and benefit from that education.
That's beautiful.
Well, it's etymology, man.
It is. That should be the next volume. Let's Get Cairns. It's etymology, man. Talk about the word meaning. We got into it a moment ago when we talked about visual art and poetry, and folks will to some degree use the question like a crowbar, like what does this mean? I'm trying to get into it. Yeah. What is meaning?
Well, look at that etymology as well. The mean isn't all. It's just the little you make meaning. It's like, Coleridge used to talk about he had his figure of speech when he talked about the acquisition of wisdom. He spoke about landing places, like a winding staircase that you ascend. But there are landing places along that, you go up this flight, there's a landing place. Catch your breath, get your bearings, make your meaning. That's the mean for the moment. Then you ascend again to the next landing place, which is another place of meaning making, a place where the mean is apprehended.
I love that image.
But you don't stay at the landing place. Meaning has to be understood as an endless acquisition of, I guess what I'd like to call it truth, but I think that's too heavy-handed. But an endless acquisition of awareness, and so making meaning has to be understood as nothing we ever do conclusively, but always in part provisionally. And then, we gather up whatever gear we have and we climb another flight.
Poetry. Yeah. What is when I say poetry, what happens in you?
Oh yeah. Well, pieces, or as people who don't know how to pronounce Greek would say poesis. But
that'd be me.
Yeah. But it's a wonderful word. It's all about making. We're making. Poetry is really you take all you can hold and you make something with it. Something discrete that nonetheless gestures toward the enormity.
Yes.
That led to it, and which it might participate in. So poetry is I'd say the highest form of poesis, poesis, and it's I think that the poetic operation of language is is what distinguishes literary art from popular literary writing from popular writing, I guess, is the degree to which the poetic operation of language operates in it. And so when I think of the poetic operation of language, it's that opening.
Yeah.
It's you know that when you're reading, this happens in novels, happens in dramas, theatrical texts, happens in some songs, some musical texts. You know, it's when the word is framed in such a way that you see more going on than the word itself discreetly might have done. But in this combination of words, that word opens up for you. And the poetic operation of language is the life. It's where we glimpse the living nature of language. Beautiful. Certainly of scripture and of great poems. Poems, you know, that's why you can read a great poem subsequent times, and
yes,
you can see something more each time.
Or a sacred text in the same way.
Absolutely. You know, you read a verse one day and it serves you, it delivers to you what you need, but it's not exhausted.
No.
In that activity, you know, you read that verse the next day or several days later, and it may deliver something else to you that you need that moment. So this sort of participatory imperative,
yeah,
is operating and visible in that example. You know,
that's good.
The text is alive because it can support continued benefit
in conversation and engagement over time.
Yeah, and that's what you are. That's what you become. A conversational partner with God when you read the scriptures, or when you read. I think when you read nature, nature itself is just something of a text, which benefits from our attending to it. So
that's really good.
We benefit by attending to.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't set you up for this, so we don't have to necessarily do it. I don't know if you have specifically the volume I mentioned before. I have it right here next to me.
Anaphora.
If you have that near you, they're fantastic. It's beautiful, and so at some point here, I'd like to wrap things up in the next few minutes with 2 points. And one is, I'd love for you to read a piece from this volume, either one of your choosing that you strongly prefer, or I continue to come back to the piece called Slow Pilgrim.
Okay.
So that would be my choice. But if you have something else, I'd love you to read that piece for us.
Yeah, it's right here. I'll read that piece.
Thank you.
It has an epigraph. You know how epigraphs work, right? Epigraphs are what lazy poets do to save time.
After 10 volumes, you're allowed some of these permissions.
There's a new one coming out in about a year called Lacunae. Just so you know.
Looking forward to it.
I am too. I saw the road and saw myself and fled. That's the epigraph. I saw the road and saw myself and fled. Suppose the pilgrim's ready. Let's say that he begins. Let's say he lifts his bed and stuffs it in a sack, then wanders off into the rain, determined now at least to make a fitting end. Thus, of one late given day, while cedars weep and hemlocks dip their crests, the bracken drip and tremble as a pool of varied green. As he sets off to beat the underbrush, an indistinct and mute immensity obtains en route. Just so. Therein, a long-held dim desire for what might pass for progress leads him to a road and lately to a narrow path inscribed to cross a wilderness where, with something of an unaccustomed turn, that same vague wish becomes a taste for the vertiginous, a vast expanse upheld, if not contained, just here among the bracken, as perhaps within one's own walled garden's hidden grove. The wish occasions then another opening and momentary glimpse, within which more than can be gathered is nonetheless beheld. That's kind of what we've been talking about in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
I had forgotten that part.
That's a beautiful piece.
But evidently I've been working its terrain subconsciously. And if you wanted the second one, I would finish with Nepsis or Nipsis, which is
Yeah,
the
let's
last.
do. I would love that. I want to have you answer one more question, and then
Yeah, go ahead.
and then we'll close it out with that second
Yeah.
poem. Is one of my introductions to you came through Gregory Wolfe, who you've worked with on a couple volumes in a few different contexts.
Yeah.
And at one of the Glenn workshops, I was introduced to the to the phrase. I think it might have honestly been on a bumper sticker. You know, beauty will save the world was this. Which
we
at
do
the
have
time,
a bumper sticker that says that.
there it is, and it was. You know, there's a way in which, at least for me initially, like it was cute. It was a cute thought. He was dead serious about it. Like it was a very serious expression for him, and he's a very serious person. And so I was a little off. I was struck by this. It's the kind of thing again that appears on a bumper sticker, but for him and the way he communicated it in an essay and during one of the presentations at the Glen, it was an essential driving truth for an artist.
Yeah.
In a time when, and this is and by that in a time I mean now, when everything seems on fire, every issue is a burning issue. Urgencies abound. Everything is of importance. Everything seems to be of the utmost importance. In seasons like this, art publicly at least in conversation, seems to get relegated to something that's less necessary. It's a thing we can get to when we're done taking care of the business of life.
Right. Yeah.
Wolf's expression counters that. And I believe this now, but I would love to hear you articulate, why is art, specifically poetry, necessary now? Like, why is it necessary and good for people to be writing their poems and reading poetry? Why is art, specifically poetry, necessary now?
Interior strength is necessary now. Interior let's stick with interior strength. And how does one acquire interior strength? Say through stillness. And I think art avails for us a moment of stillness. Great art, in particular, stops us and gives it and quiets us, and all the clamor falls away for not forever, but for a moment. And in that moment, one regains a sense of self, a sense of one's connection to the mystery. And in that stillness, we find food for the journey, and we then take up our arms and our burdens and proceed to assist the world how we might, with our voting and our rabble rousing and our door knocking. And that's all important work, that exterior work, but to have the strength for it, you have to have the resources. So food for the journey is what art provides. Yeah, I did also, as you were mentioning, beauty will save the world. no less than Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor have also employed the term.
He might have borrowed it somewhere.
Yeah. And so it's not a new idea. It's one that I think stands up. Yeah, it's not to discount the need to act and the need to do in the world. I guess to assist in the liberation of the world. Not
That's fantastic.
largest sense of that, I mean. But you have to have some interior resource to have the energy to do that. And that's what art can do. That's what beauty does. That's what prayer is probably the most available access to that interior strength is to have a rule of prayer and to find that stillness in your prayer, and then go from that into whatever you must confront.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Would you please end our time with that piece? Remind me the title one more time.
It's in English we would say nepsis, and it's a word for watchfulness. In Greek, it's nepsis. Notice how the piercing winter chill fails quite to enter the heart's bright furnace. Oh, brilliant, bright furnace. Notice how the yammering electorate also fails to obtain against the heart's quiet any ground, any likely purchase to nudge the weight of long acquired stillness. Oh, pulsing stillness. What heat, what light, what pulse is this? What recourse has the weary pilgrim save to stand before that endless beckoning, to draw his every scattered member into one, to draw and so be drawn? What shall he say? O braided being, include within your deep enormity this, these, every, all. Yeah, so there we go. I hope that's useful.
It was fantastic. Thank you. It was beautiful. Thank you for your time this morning.
Justin, I appreciate it, man.
And thank you for joining me for this episode of the At Sea podcast. If you'd like to follow up with Scott and check out his work, his most recent book is fantastic, and you can pick it up actually through heartsandmindsbooks.com. Just go to literally heartsandmindsbooks.com. It's also available wherever else you might want to buy books. It's fantastic. All of his poetry work is really, honestly, I'm a fan. If you would like to, on the other hand, or as well, be part of the team of people who continue to make this podcast and a few other things happen, go to patreon.com/Justin McRoberts and join the team. We would love to have you in our corner. Until next time.